3 slaps, 1 clap. That was the moment everything changed. We were at my table, the china Aunt Lucy had given us for our 10th anniversary in a box in the attic, the roast steaming, gravy clinging to the rim of the bowl. Ariana had been cutting the meat, careful as always, the kind of care that made her a good engineer, the same patience she had when she soldered circuits in her little dorm room back when she would bring me scraps of paper covered in diagrams. A glass slig, a bead of water threaded down the side, and Mark's hand struck her face 3 times so fast I thought it was an accident at first. He hit her like someone snapping a twig. The 3rd slap landed and the sound seemed to hollow out the room. Then Helen laughed. She clapped her hands as if we'd applauded a performance. "That's how she learns to behave," she said, smiling, a small, polite smile that did not touch her eyes. The clap hung in the air like a dropped fork. My blood felt like ice water. For a heartbeat, I couldn't move. The gravy smell became an accusation. The crystal glass in my hand was suddenly weightless. I am a family law attorney. I had spent my life training others to keep their heads when the room was on fire. I knew the protocols, the evidentiary rules, the way memories bend, and how a smear is launched in 6 steps flat. None of that prepared me to find myself frozen at my own dinner table while my mother-in-law applauded my daughter's humiliation. Then, deliberately, like pulling a thread to test the seam, I reached for my phone. "This is Elena Vance," I said when Commander Miller answered. His voice was low, steady. I'd worked with him on cases before he took that post. "I'm at my house. My daughter was just hit. I'm recording." I hit record on my phone and slid it under the tablecloth where the silverware would hide it. A recording is not a talisman, but it is a tool. I had always taught clients that a timeline outlasts a story. That night, the timeline began at the sound of 3 slaps and a single approving clap. If this is touching something you know, if you or someone you care for has seen warning signs like this, tell me where you're from in the comments. Share this with a friend who needs to hear that silence is not the only option. They came faster than I'd expected. Commander Miller arrived wearing a coat that smelled faintly of old coffee and dust. He walked into my kitchen with the same mixture of procedural calm and human alarm that he always wore. Mark was taken into custody without a fight. He said nothing. His face had that immediate animal look of surprise when the world doesn't obey the narrative it had rehearsed. Helen tried to protest, indignation sliding between phrases like a practiced actress, but the recording was already captured, the witnesses already in the room. The police did what they are trained to do in the presence of clear present violence. They took statements, they secured evidence, they separated people.
Ariana sat on the far side of the table, one hand cupping her cheek. She wasn't bleeding, there were no broken bones, but there was the look that terror leaves in its wake, the stunned, hollowed-out version of a person who has been told their boundaries no longer exist. I wrapped my arms around her and felt how small she had become in a single moment. She was 27 then, competent in labs and boardrooms, fiercely intelligent. In that chair, she felt like my little girl again. We called a cab for her that night. I put extra blankets in the spare room, made herbal tea, sat with her while she put her shoes on and took them off again like she was trying on options that never fit. My professional instincts didn't shut down. They stitched into the maternal instinct until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. I made notes on my phone, names, times, odd phrases Helen had used. I saved the recording in 2 places. I did what I could, in the first hour, to make her safety palpable and immediate. Later, when it was just the 2 of us and the house had settled into a kind of exhausted quiet, she said, "I didn't think he would. I thought he might hit the wall, slam the door. Not me." "It's not your fault," I told her, because that's what you say in the immediate aftermath. It's the truth, even if it doesn't feel like one. Later, we would have long conversations about patterns and accountability, about legal options and safety plans. That night, the truth we could hold was smaller. Her body was with me. She breathed. The house was locked. When the first adrenaline ebbs, the mind begins to map what it missed. I found myself thinking of the early days, the brightness that marked Ariana's childhood. She used to take apart radios in the garage to see what made the voices come through. She was the child who studied the class when a lab project went wrong, who stayed late to recalibrate equipment because she loved the quiet hum of functioning things. Robert, my late husband, her father, used to call her our little engineer and laugh at how she could fix a toaster but be oblivious about unpacking a suitcase.
Robert's death left a particular kind of silence in our house, one that taught us to listen harder to each other. His steadiness had been a kind of moral gravity. Losing him was like losing a rudder. We adjusted, leaned into each other. That foundation is what made me fall into the reflex of protecting, of strategizing. So when Mark entered Ariana's life, I watched, and I admit now I asked myself a million questions about timing and interference. He was charming at first, polite at book launches, deferential at dinners, the kind of man who could put a room at ease. He told the right jokes, laughed in the soft places, brought flowers. He was, in many ways, the portrait he painted himself to be.
The first warning was not a slap. It was a small condescension at a party, a quip about her career that was meant to be a joke, but felt like a scissor to her enthusiasm. She minimized it, as people do, because minimizing buys time and keeps the peace. The cracks widened slowly. He began to suggest who she should see, who she should socialize with. He suggested she step back from a lab collaboration that would have meant long nights together. He questioned purchases, the kind of comments that feel trivial at first and later gridlock a person's life. He checked her phone, just to be sure. He would stand in doorways and watch her when she answered the phone. These are the kinds of things you can rationalize away until the rationalizations tax you. Then the first physical incident happened. Nothing dramatic at the time, a shove that sent her against a doorway during a disagreement. The neighbors heard a noise, no one called. She told me about it days later with the kind of embarrassment that feels like a curse. Shame. I pushed him, she said, to spare him. She said it because abusers train the room to rewrite events, and because pride has its own blinders. I remember wanting to take her and run, and wanting to stand in a courthouse and deliver a 3-hour lecture on coercive control. Instead, I breathed and learned in new, painful ways what it is to be both mother and counsel. My advice to manifest safety had to be measured, trauma-informed, and personal. What I knew from cases was clear. Control escalates. Isolation becomes its own punishment. An abuser will seek to redefine who you can be, and then punish any attempt to reclaim yourself. Helen was different from Mark, but not entirely. She wrapped herself in the language of decorum and family honor. When she applauded that night, she wasn't just approving of a single act. She was endorsing an entire system where obedience is prized over personhood. The days after the arrest were a flurry of forms and procedure. Commander Miller advised on immediate safety measures. Statements were taken. Evidence was cataloged. The recording, my battered phone tucked in a drawer, became a small humming promise that words could be checked against actions. In my work, I had often warned clients, documents outlive moods. You must keep the receipts of what was done and what was said. That principle felt nakedly personal now. Mark was held briefly that night. Whether he remained in custody depended on the discretion of the department and the county's policies. Those are the kinds of things that vary by jurisdiction, and I don't pretend to have universal answers. What became immediately evident was that arrest was only a first step. It changes the battleground, but it doesn't end the campaign. You exchange slaps for subpoenas with social media for smear sheets. You trade private fear for public scrutiny. We learned fast that Helen was not going to be a passive bystander.
She published a statement the next morning, polite, bemused, about family disagreements and misunderstandings. She hinted at a narrative that this was a blown event, exaggerated, misrepresented. Her friends, people with access to money and connections, started to ring offices and make inquiries. Old acquaintances who had once written checks for charitable galas began to distance themselves with an economy of comment and the arrogance of plausible deniability. Reputation is a commodity. It can be spent, saved, hoarded, weaponized. That was when the professional and the maternal collided again. I had a board hearing postponed for unrelated reasons, my calendar filled with a succession of legalistic tasks, but more urgent was the campaign that would begin to undermine my daughter in the public eye. In the weeks that followed, anonymous posts appeared on blogs, allegations surfaced on message boards, sometimes petty, sometimes vicious. Someone filed a complaint with the licensing board where Ariana worked. Someone else hinted that her mental health was unstable. The smear campaign was surgical in its cruelty. It didn't need to be true. It only needed to be loud. And still, there were acts of small bravery. Commander Miller, who had been on my porch the night the slaps landed, became an advocate within the system. He knew the value of solid documents. He knew credible witnesses. He listened to my notes and my chain of custody for the recording and treated it as what it was, evidence of a moment where control became physical. Not every officer is the same. I know that from a career watching institutions. But the ones who showed up were steady. That steadiness matters. Ariana moved into the spare room in my house for a while. She began to unspool the story for me in fits and starts, as one unwraps a fragile heirloom, careful not to damage it further.
She described the little ways Mark had tried to make the world small for her, the friend who was suddenly less reliable, the grant application that came under unexpected scrutiny, the ways Helen would ask pointedly about her father's death and whether she knew too much. Helen's laughter that evening, the clap, wasn't isolated. It fit a pattern. There is a particular cruelty in generational abuse, the elder who teaches the younger how to calibrate shame, who models a transactional love. This is how cycles perpetuate themselves. Helen's smile that night taught everyone at that table what behavior the family rewarded. It taught Mark that the family's code permitted his violence, and taught my daughter that the most dangerous people were sometimes the ones who stood nearest to protect her. When people ask me what changed after that night, they assume I will tell them about trials and convictions. Those things came later. They are part of the arc of this story, but they are not the only measure of change. What changed immediately was that we documented, we preserved.
We told the truth in ways that resisted being rewritten. I made lists the way I advise clients to do, not as legal prescriptions. I'm not instructing anyone reading this, but as a matter of sanity. I wrote down dates, times, phrases that had been used with particular cruelty. I saved screenshots of online posts that attacked Ariana. I backed up emails. I put copies of relevant texts into 3 separate cloud accounts and a thumb drive tucked into a safety deposit box. Documentation isn't heroic, it's tedious, and it is often the thing that separates a rumor from a case. The work of collecting proof is quiet work. It is the opposite of applause. We also reached out for emotional support. Ariana began seeing a counselor who specialized in trauma. Healing is not linear. I know that from both my life and my work. There were sessions that felt like walking through a house where the lights were all out, and others that felt like mapping a garden. I insisted, softly, that she not take on the burden of being the family scandal alone. That meant boundaries, explicit, sometimes ugly conversations about who would be allowed in the house, about what would be shared on social media, and about the workers who would be allowed to deliver packages without passing messages to certain people. And then came the first legal volley from the other side, a cease and desist letter, thinly veiled in legalese, accusing us of malicious conduct and threatening defamation claims. It was blunt in its purpose, to frighten, to intimidate, to raise costs. I had seen these moves before. I had warned clients that the first battles after an allegation are often not about the core question of violence, but about power, about who can afford noise and who will be drowned by it. The calculus was not ethical, it was financial and reputational. At night, I would sometimes sit in the garden where the lemon tree used to bend with fruit and ask myself the question people expect mothers to answer with certainty. Was it worth it? Did dragging our private pain into public view actually protect my daughter, or did it expose her to a greater kind of harm? There is no simple answer. The immediate cost was steep. Ari lost contracts, friends withdrew, and we felt the quiet thinness of support that had once seemed bedrock. We received anonymous threats. There were moments where the calculus of safety and privacy felt like steering between jagged rocks. I wrestled with guilt. Did I escalate? Could I have handled it differently? The mother in me kept an open ledger of things I might have missed. The lawyer in me recognized that missing things doesn't equal consent to harm. The question, was it worth it, kept returning like an echo, and I began to believe the answer would have to come from how Ariana rebuilt herself, not from how those 2 hours of a night played out in the court of public opinion. The initial weeks were a blur of interviews and debriefs, reporters called, eager for a scandal. I refused most of them, but the reality is that a story like ours becomes public in part because the people who can amplify it choose to. That can be a blessing and a hazard. Some journalists were respectful, treating the facts as delicate. Others wanted the sensation, the single line to hang on their mastheads. I set boundaries about what Ariana would discuss. Her healing mattered more than someone's headline. And then, like a slow tide revealing a hidden coastline, a thread began to pull free. A former cousin of Mark's, a quiet man named Albert Harrison, reached out through a secure email with details that didn't make sense if you accepted the family's public version of events. He spoke of patterns, of conversations that hinted at a willingness to remove problems rather than resolve them. He mentioned a past incident involving Mark's brother, something that had been dismissed at the time as an accident. Albert's account was small and precise. He did not want attention. He wanted his cousin's child to be safe. I listened. He was terrified, and for good reason. That is how investigations tend to begin, not with a dramatic confession, but with a small, steady drip of inconvenient facts. When someone like Albert chooses to speak, it rarely feels like heroism. It feels like survival. He feared exposure himself. But the bits of information he shared planted a seed that would later grow into something that complicated the narrative of the Harrison family
and changed the way prosecutors saw certain events. At the same time, the smear campaign adopted new shapes. Anonymous blogs posted doctored images. An accountant we trusted received an audit notice from an aggressive firm with ties to a friend of Helen's. An old college acquaintance began whispering about Ariana's temperament. These things wear on you in the slow way of erosion. They were designed to make us doubt what we had, to render the evidence fuzzy by drowning it in allegations. I will not pretend to have always kept my temper. There were days I wanted to walk into a courtroom and deliver a speech so sharp it would cut through the noise. There were nights I sat at my desk and wept for the child who had been taught that obedience was love. But the work of law is patient. It is a dismantling of a lie through accumulation. One receipt, one email, one secure recording at a time. People often ask whether it was harder to fight them or to fight the way the community folded around their narrative. Both were hard, but in different ways. Fighting the narrative demanded stamina. You must be prepared to counter not just facts, but the architecture of reputation. You must be prepared for the quiet exodus of people who would rather not be on the side of a scandal, even if the scandal exposes real harm. There was one particularly strange moment in that first month. Helen visited a mutual friend's luncheon with the sort of practiced poise that had probably been honed over decades.
She laughed at the right intervals and spoke about charity work. Afterward, the hostess sent a note. "We were all surprised to hear about your situation, Elena. I hope this is resolved." People wanted to believe the comfortable story. Belief is an adhesive. It sticks, and then everything that contradicts it seems inconvenient. But documents don't care about social comfort. We have the recording. We had witnesses. We had medical notes from the night after the dinner where Ariana sought care. We had texts where Mark had threatened consequences if she told anyone. Those things, lined up, made an argument. They did not guarantee outcome. They made a case. The difference is subtle but crucial. Throughout it all, I kept thinking of Robert, how he would have wanted us to act. He was a man of quiet principles. He would have set his jaw and done the work without flourish. We tried to honor that steadiness. Ariana began to reclaim pieces of her life, a project here, a friendship there. She started to go back into the world, testing it like a foot over cold water. The next phase of the story is where the cost starts to count in public currency and private tolls. This is where lawsuits get filed, where subpoenas cross thresholds, where anonymous accusations calcify into campaigns, and where the family applies pressure in ways that test whether institutions will stand their ground. It is where evidence must speak louder than the applause that greets violence at a family table. I had called Commander Miller that night. That call had shifted the trajectory. It had turned a private humiliation into public prerogative. It made the clap a piece of evidence, not merely a gesture. For that reason, it was the call that, if someone asked me to point to the moment that set everything into motion, I would name without hesitation. Was it worth it? The answer is not a single word. There is a cost, financial, emotional, social, that we paid and continue to pay. There is also the cost that would have accrued had we stayed silent, the invisible ledger of what adolescents learn when a family rewards obedience to humiliation, the way a daughter's professional reputation can be quietly undermined and then weaponized. The question is not solely whether the call was worth it, but whether dignity matters enough to pay the price. In my bones, I have come to believe that dignity does matter, but belief is not evidence. It is the willingness to bear consequence. We were not naive about what would come. In the weeks that followed, we assembled the small army of allies who would carry us through. A trauma counselor who offered both practical and emotional support, a private investigator who knew how to trace the faint signals that families like the Harrisons used to obfuscate, and Commander Miller, who ensured that the police reports reflected what had genuinely occurred, rather than the softened version that often appears in domestic disputes. We kept the recording secure.
We protected Ariana's privacy as fiercely as we could. Even with those measures, the first skirmishes were brutal. Mark's friends, people who had once been at our house for barbecues, began to write op-eds about family complexity and the perils of modern accusation. The language was coded, but its intent was not. To dilute, to confuse, to make the public say, maybe both sides have truth. The smear campaign was surgical in its cruelty because it understood that an equivocal public is a forgiving public. At home, the small rituals returned: morning coffee, the clack of a keyboard, a walk in the garden. But beneath that rhythm was a sustained, dull anxiety, like the hum of machines that keep a hospital wing running. You can live in a house and feel the world outside rewriting the furniture. That experience isolates you in ways you cannot explain to people who have never been on the receiving end of reputation warfare. When I look back now, months later, I can see how that first call created a cascade. It is easy in retrospect to map the dominoes. At the time, I knew only that each act created another context, another place where truth could be either buried or revealed. We chose to reveal it. We chose to hold the clap up to the light. There was, however, another discovery that would push the story into darker waters. Evidence that was not about one slap at one table, but about a pattern spanning years. Secrets that certain people would move heaven and earth to keep quiet. That discovery did not come at the courthouse. It arrived in the slow, unglamorous way of piles of records and hesitant testimony. It came from people who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking. But that belongs to the next chapter of the story, where the battle widens and more lives are caught in the crossfire. For now, in the quiet that followed the first storm, I taught myself patience. Not resignation, patience. I held Ariana's hand while she learned how to be in a room again without flinching. I sat in rooms with counsel and coded language and knew how precarious each step could be. I learned to celebrate the small victories: a successful meeting, a kind word from a neighbor, a text from someone who chose to believe her. The napkin I used that night, the one that caught the recording phone when I pushed it under the tablecloth, still lives in a drawer. It's an absurd relic, but sometimes I open that drawer and take it out and run my fingers over it, and remember that small decisions accrue into history. The call ended a kind of private balance where a family could pretend their affairs didn't reach the world beyond their doorstep. It opened a different chapter: public, painful, messy, but also honest. There is no neat end to this moment. There is only the work that follows, the slow unmasking and the hard questions about what institutions will do when reputation is pitted against evidence.
There is the question of whether we will see accountability in its fullness, or if the system will fray at the edges. There is also, quietly, the possibility of restoration, of a daughter who learns again how to set boundaries, a mother who finds new ways to support without consuming, and a community that slowly, imperfectly, learns what it means to hold people to account. And so we moved into the next phase, into subpoenas, into counters, into an array of pressures I could never have imagined at my own table. We had the recording, we had the witnesses, and we had each other. That is not a guarantee. It is, however, a beginning. The package arrived on a wet Tuesday morning, the kind of gray day that makes the house look like it's holding its breath. I was at my desk when the courier knocked. No return address, just our name, and an old postage mark that suggested it had taken the long way around. Inside was a plain manila envelope and a small, unremarkable USB drive tucked into a napkin. There was also a single sheet of paper with a message scrawled in a handwriting that seemed half hesitant, half determined. "You need this, A." I felt an old, professional skepticism rise. How many hoaxes had I seen? How many traps set for people who wanted to look heroic? Then I thought of Albert's email and how cautious he'd been. I remembered his fear when he wrote that he had seen things and didn't want to hurt anyone more than the truth already had. I called our private investigator before I touched the drive. The PI handled the work the way surgeons handle scalpels, quietly, meticulously. He created a chain of custody, sent the drive for forensic imaging, and compared the files against known records. The media files were older than the drive. Their metadata dated back years. There were audio files, fragmented, raw, that contained voices with accents and cadences I knew in the context of the family. There were also documents, ledgers, receipts, a note that read like someone trying to justify an unpleasant decision. The most chilling file, though, was a recording of a conversation between two voices where one of them, unmistakably in my ear now, laughed and said, "Problems get solved. We don't leave things in the middle of tables." I listened to that last line with a kind of mechanical calm. Evidence is a strange thing. It flattens emotion into verifiable facts, and yet when it implicates people you have shared platters and holidays with, those facts feel like betrayal. The PI found emails that suggested hush payments, transfers to shell accounts, and a contractor paid to repair the brakes on a car that had once failed on a rural road, details that now look less like accidents and more like convenient explanations. Albert's testimony filled the contours of the files.
He gave names, dates, the kind of small recollections, an offhand joke at a family barbecue, a text message deleted and then recreated to fit a story, that are rarely dramatic on their own, but when gathered, produce a pattern. He spoke of how Helen had always prized reputation over people, of how she would murmur about keeping the line clean. He was not a dramatic witness. He sat with his hands folded and told the truth as if he were returning a badly packed box, careful, precise, apologetic. What began as an assault case widened into an investigation that pointed to events from years earlier, an unexplained death,
a fender bender that had been closed as an accident, a will that had been amended at an odd hour. Prosecutors are cautious creatures by necessity. They need more than suspicion. They need admissible evidence, corroboration, and a narrative that will survive cross-examination. We gave them both. The recording from my table, which demonstrated a pattern of contempt and permission, the new files that suggested motive and method, Albert's testimony, which provided a human link between documents and reality. The district attorney we met with had the look of someone who has had to choose whether to reopen wounds for the sake of truth. She asked the questions I respect most. Can we prove this to a jury? Can we authenticate the files? Are there witnesses who will not break under pressure? We answered as best we could. Proof is not certainty, it is persuasion. A prosecutor's job is to decide whether the evidence persuades. The defense tried to derail everything from the first moment. They challenged the chain of custody on the USB, questioned Albert's motives, and launched a broadside aimed at discrediting Ariana. It was predictable and ugly. Their strategy was clear: make Ariana seem unstable, paint me as a vengeful mother, and turn the public's attention back to complex family dynamics. They filed motions designed to delay, to hope that time would erode the attention and patience of everyone involved. For a moment, I felt we were back at the table again. Helen's practiced smile, the world preferring a neat story to a messy truth. Court hearings, depositions, forensic reports, the calendar filled with dates that meant nothing to the people who weren't living through them, and everything to us. There were days when the set of objects in my life felt absurd. A stack of exhibits, a photograph with a corner creased from being held too long, the now familiar napkin in a plastic evidence bag. Ari's counselor walked with her to each hearing when she could. I arranged for someone to be present whenever the testimony became likely to reopen fresh wounds. Testifying is a strange intimacy where your private struggles become public exhibits. I watched her sit under glare and say what she had always said to me in the dark. This wasn't my fault. The first trial focused on Mark.
The charges were assault and violation of a protective order after an earlier scare that had been dismissed out of fear. We had the recording from my table and the witnesses who were present that night. The defense painted him as a man under stress, as someone who had been provoked. They used the language that has always been effective in domestic cases: minimize, reframe, suggest mutual fault. But the prosecutor's opening statement returned us to that kitchen. 3 slaps, 1 clap. He described how Helen's smile had condensed years of permission into a single moment, and how that mattered to how the jury would understand intent. A testimony like Ariana's carries a quiet power. She spoke without theatrical flourish. She spoke the way engineers explain problems: measured, precise, unwilling to let emotion dilute the facts. When she described the small techniques of control, the phone checks, the missing colleagues, the orchestrated helpfulness that always ended up as control, the judge leaned forward, the jurors scribbled. The defense cross-examined for sympathy, for inconsistency, for anything that could make her seem less credible. They found nothing that dismantled the core of her account. There was a moment in that trial that I will always carry. As a witness, Ariana was asked by the prosecutor about the dinner and the sound that had folded our kitchen in half. She said, "I didn't think it would be me. I thought he might break a plate, close a door. I didn't think a person could make that sound in my ear and then have my grandmother clap." The courtroom was silent in a way that felt almost holy. That silence was evidence, too, the human inability to ignore the conjunction of violence and approval. Mark was convicted on multiple counts. The jury's verdict was not a balm. Sentencing cannot remove the fact of what happened at my table, nor can it erase the weeks of fear and follow-up assaults on reputation. It was, however, a public acknowledgement. The state had heard and found that the pattern of behavior met the criminal threshold. He received a sentence that reflected both the assault and the violation of the court's orders. The sentence included a component of treatment programs and restrictions that made the world feel marginally safer. In the judge's steady voice, I heard that rare thing: accountability. Helen's case moved in a different register and was more complicated. The new evidence did not point to a single night, but to a pattern that suggested calculated elimination of problems. That is a gravely serious allegation to make against anyone, let alone someone who had presided over luncheons and charity events. The prosecution moved cautiously. They had to prove more than motive. They had to prove action, and to do so in a way that would stand up to certain and brutal cross-examination. The defense tried to argue that the files were fabrications, that people with grudges could assemble convincing narratives.
They hired experts who criticized forensic timelines and suggested alternative explanations. In those days, the world contorted around technical minutiae. file timestamps, server traces, bank records. If the case against Helen ascended, it did so on the back of meticulous forensic work and witnesses like Albert, who testified about the conversational context that made sense of the files. He spoke of jokes that were not jokes, of a culture in the family that treated silence as a virtue and dissent as a threat. Helen took the stand in her own defense. She was composed, coiffed, and measured. She spoke of family loyalties and inconvenience. Her performance was polished. It had to be. For many in the community, she remained the woman who hosted tea and distributed philanthropic checks. For those of us who had sat at her table, she had revealed something colder. The jury had to decide which portrait matched the facts. The prosecution offered the recordings, the ledgers, and a chain of witness statements that together suggested a willingness to silence problems rather than resolve them. The defense called it conspiracy thinking. The prosecution called it pattern and motive. It was not cinematic, a dramatic confession on a hot microphone, but rather the accumulation of many small things that were never random once you took them seriously. When the jury returned a guilty verdict, there was a sound in the courtroom that was not applause. It was the exhale of people who had held their breath for months. Helen was convicted of charges related to her involvement in that earlier death and in a pattern of obstruction and cover-up. She received a sentence that reflected the gravity of those charges. She was not, in any meaningful way, reduced to a caricature. She remained, to some, a benefactor and mother-in-law, to others, the architect of harm. The conviction did what convictions do. It put a legal seal on a narrative that had occupied our kitchen like a shadow. I do not say those things lightly. The trials were not triumphs of righteousness over evil. They were the hard, bureaucratic work of establishing fact. They cost us money, sleep, relationships, and a kind of innocence. We were criticized by some for bringing family business to court. We were lauded by others as examples of standing up. Neither response told the whole story. The truth of the matter is ambivalent and lived. Ariana lost contracts during the process. A few friends never returned calls, and we were subject to anonymous messages often enough to keep the skin of us thin. There is a private ledger we do not often show in public, the way trauma reshapes appetite and humor, how nights open and close with a new vigilance, how trust must be relearned. Ariana moved into a modest apartment 3 towns over. She took a position at a company that valued her work and did not ask prying questions. She dated with caution, and eventually with caution easing into hope. She found a partner whose gestures were kind in the ordinary way kindness shows itself, sending coffee without fanfare, asking how her day went, listening without offering solutions. Those small things felt revolutionary. We rebuilt in practical ways. We paid legal bills with the dignity grinding down like sand. We sold a few things that felt tied to the old life. I spent nights drafting op-eds about the scourge of reputation warfare and the necessity of evidence. I lectured less and counseled more. The bar hearing that had felt like an ominous cloud was resolved with a reprimand that later was reduced, and I returned to practice with an altered sense of what it means to be visible in your profession, while also being the target of a campaign meant to undermine that visibility. I will not pretend that my professional standing was untouched, but I will say this. Convictions helped restore more than just legal order. They restored the possibility that institutions could, at times, do their job. We began to hear from other women, small messages at first. Your story encouraged me to leave. I didn't know what to do. Then larger, braver notes. I came forward because you did. That was in its own way a kind of justice that had nothing to do with courts. There was a ripple effect. Other investigations opened as people felt emboldened to speak. It was not a tidal wave. Too often these things are piecemeal and slow. But change, incremental though it may be, has its own dignity. And still, the question lingered in my quieter hours. Was it worth it? That question had haunted me in the lemon tree garden and in the courtroom halls. Was dragging private pain through public scrutiny worth the cost? I have thought about that question often, and the answer grows more complicated with time. If we measure worth by how many things remained exactly as they were before, by whether friendships returned intact, whether the gossip stopped, whether every door opened again, then no, the cost was steep. We paid in ways that still leave small scars. There are holidays that will always have an emptier chair, and conversations that circle gently now because we do not want to inflame old wounds. I would be sentimental to say otherwise. But if the measure is dignity, if the question is whether a young woman should be taught that the way to handle humiliation is to accept it, then yes. If the measure is whether a family system that rewarded compliance over personhood should be confronted, then yes. If the measure is whether a pattern that might have led to further violence was interrupted, then yes. The legal victories did not erase the pain,
but they did shift the balance. They said in a public institutional way that certain behaviors are unacceptable and that people who facilitate them are accountable. They gave Ariana the space she needed to rebuild without the immediate threat always at her door. They allowed other people to see that reputation is not a shield for harm.
We did not come out untouched. There were financial consequences, legal fees that would take years to pay down. There was the social toll, colleagues who kept distance, invitations that quietly stopped arriving. But there were also gains, a younger generation of women who saw that silence need not be the only option, a prosecutor who told me privately that our case helped refine her office's handling of domestic violence matters, and an investigator who later testified that the chain of evidence we insisted upon prevented a false narrative from taking hold. Healing for Ariana and for me was not a single moment. It was a series of small, steadfast acts, therapy appointments, a support group that met at a community center, dinners with friends who had watched and waited and then re-engaged in ways that were quiet and reliable, the slow recommitment to work and to joy. She took a trip 3 years later to a cabin by a lake and came back with a photograph of her smiling in a way that read like permission. She started mentoring younger engineers, not because she wanted to be an activist on all days, but because she wanted to point at the possibility that your career need not be collateral in your healing. I learned too. The mother who had, in a kind of professional arrogance, thought she could measure and predict any courtroom, now knows the limits of both law and love. I learned that protecting someone sometimes demands you trade comfort for consequence. I learned that there are no easy scripts, and that dignity costs money and sleep and social capital. I also learned that dignity is a currency you cannot spend once and forget. It is something you invest every day by refusing to accept violence as normal. The community we live in has shifted, not because of one conviction or one lecture, but because people began to ask different questions at dinner parties and in PTA meetings. They began to listen when friends said, "He checks my phone," or "She insists I not see my family." Those small moments of attention may prevent other families from sitting in the same painful choreography we did. That change is not clashy. It is steady and slow, and perhaps the most hopeful thing of all. There is an ethical knot I want to untie for anyone listening. Going public is not the only route. For some, privacy and quiet safety planning are the only viable path. For others, public confrontation is necessary. My story is one route, sharpened by my profession and our particular circumstances. I am mindful that not everyone's story can or should follow the same arc. Yet I will say this strongly. When you see a pattern, when you hear applause for violence, when you recognize a system that rewards control, say something. Do not let reputation become a shield for harm. Years from that night, I sat in my garden with Ariana while the sun lowered like a promise.
We were quiet for a long time, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence was, for once, not a hollow. She handed me a cup of tea and, without rancor, said, "We lost a lot, Mom." I nodded. "We also got some things back," she added. "I can sleep with the windows open." It is a small thing, but a precious one, the ability to occupy space without flinching. When people ask me now whether I would make that phone call again, the one I made on a frantic kitchen night, I answer without hesitation, yes. That call changed everything. Its ripple reached into spaces I could not have predicted. It brought in men and women I would not have otherwise needed, and it forced a community to choose which story they wanted to tell about themselves. It cost us dearly. It also saved something integral, Ariana's dignity, my ability to teach my daughter that obedience to humiliation is not a virtue, and perhaps in a small way, the safety of people yet unknown to us. If there is a lesson I would leave you with, it is not a list of legal steps, it is an ethic. Document what you can, protect what you must, seek help, and believe that dignity is worth defending. The systems are imperfect, the process is often ugly. Still, evidence matters, witnesses matter. A recording can survive forgetting, a ledger can outlive a lie. Those are not the only tools. Community, counselors, and safety plans are equally vital, but they are real tools, and they can be decisive. Before I close, a practical word to anyone who recognizes themselves in Ariana's story. You are not alone, and there are places to turn for help. If you are in immediate danger, call your local emergency number. For general support and confidential assistance, look for national hotlines and local shelters. We've listed some reputable resources in the description below. Reach out to friends you trust, to professionals who specialize in trauma,
to law enforcement if it feels safe to do so, and to advocates who understand how reputation is weaponized. None of those steps is guaranteed or easy, but they are choices you can make with people who will stand with you. This is not a story of triumph in the simplistic sense. It is not a tale where good instantly overcomes bad and everyone rejoices. It is, however, a story that says accountability can be sought, that lives can be rebuilt, and that a mother's refusal to accept humiliation on her child's behalf can change the arc of a family. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Subscribe for more survivor narratives that attempt to make sense of the messy, hard work of rebuilding. The description below includes links to general resources and hotlines. If you're looking for specifics in your area, those listings are a good place to start. And one last thing, which I have come back to again and again. True love never hurts.